Hey everybody, Timothy here for Sharp Level Music. If you happen to wonder who's this guy, I'm the one who does all the guitar transcriptions on the channel. Jore has been more on the forefront lately, making wonderful videos, and I'm doing stuff in the back. Whatever. Now I'm back on camera for a bit. I just had the most wonderful talk with Dr. Molly Gebrian. She is a violist with a background in cognitive neuroscience, so she is an expert on all things practicing technique, how the brain works, how music and language is related, and ear training, improvisation. We cover a lot of ground. So I'm not gonna make this little introduction too long. Sit back, enjoy, chunk it up if you need to. It's quite a long talk, but it's incredibly interesting and fascinating. And there's a lot of information and there are a lot of great insights. All I can say is enjoy. First of all, thank you so much for coming on this chat.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, I have a bazillion questions and thoughts, but
Awesome. Hopefully I have a bazillion answers.
Probably. Maybe just to kick things off, let's have a little introduction of yourself.
Sounds good. How much do you want?
As much as you feel like.
Okay, sounds good. The short introduction is that I'm a violist with a background in cognitive neuroscience, and my area of expertise is applying the science of learning and memory to practicing and performing. So that's like the super short version of my background. The longer version of my background is I am a violist, and I went to college intending to study viola and something else. I went to Overlearning College and Conservatory where it's very easy to double major. And I didn't know what else I wanted to study when I got there. I just, I have a lot of interests. And then I took a neuroscience class my first semester there, and I was instantly hooked. And I was like, okay, this is fascinating. Like, I want to learn more about this. And so it was really just for my own personal interest. Like, I was there, I was paying for college anyway, like, might as well, right? And I didn't have any plans to connect it to music, to go on with it, like not at all. And then after I graduated, I went to New England Conservatory, where I teach now, actually, but just to study viola, to get my master's in viola. And I very quickly realized that I really missed the neuroscience. But obviously, you can't take science classes at a conservatory, right? So I was very lucky that they allowed me to do some independent studies, just looking into things that I had started to become interested in at Oberlin. I had started to see connections between what I was learning in my neuroscience classes about how the brain learns and what my viola teacher was teaching me about good practice habits. And I wanted to learn more about that. So I started looking into that again, just for my own sort of personal interest. And then after that, I went to Rice University to get my doctorate in viola, but I was back at that's a big research institution. So I was like, oh, wait, maybe I can take neuroscience classes again. So I did. I took graduate level neuroscience classes pretty much the whole time I was there. I worked in a lab pretty much the whole time I was there. And I also was the assistant director for two interdisciplinary like symposia on music and the brain with a composition professor, Tony Brandt, who's also interested in this stuff. And as part of that, to get like student interest in this thing that we were trying to do, the school asked me to do, it was a lunchtime series called Pizza and Brains. And the school bought pizza for the students. And I just like gave a presentation essentially on whatever I wanted to about, brains and music. And that was the first time I really started like teaching other people what I knew. And I was like, oh, this is really fun. Like, I like this. And other people are like really interested in this too. So then, yeah, over the years, I've just continued to do that. I've been a viola professor for the last 10 years, continuing to do presentations on this, write about this. I have my YouTube channel, right, where I talk about this, but it was all kind of on the side. Now, over last summer, I moved back to Boston, and I'm now teaching at New England Conservatory, and I'm doing this kind of full time now in terms of like teaching people how to practice and sharing the science, and it's great to be able to do that. So yeah, my my story is a little weird, but that's the long version.
Nice. It's very interesting. And yeah, I stumbled upon you through YouTube, of course,
YouTube,
and
yeah.
it's you need to bring your own pizza, but
That's true. You have to bring your own pizza, unfortunately.
no, yeah, that I love the channel, and it's I've been binging those videos and all the
Thank you.
guest videos and whatever. It's so fascinating and interesting. Um, and you mentioned your viola teacher already was providing like some good practice
Mhm.
strategies and stuff like that. Was that like the starting point for?
Yeah, I mean, so when I was 15, so far before I started thinking about neuroscience, I got tendonitis really badly in both wrists from playing, and I had to take an entire summer off from playing to recuperate. And I worked with a doctor here in Boston, actually, Dr. Michael Charnas, who specializes in musicians' injuries. And I'm so lucky that I got connected with him. And he gave me this very strict schedule to come back to playing so I didn't re-injure myself. I was allowed to practice 2 minutes on the first day, and I had to
Oh
add two
wow.
minutes every day. It was very, very slow. And so, like, 2 minutes, like, what can you do in 2 minutes? Right. And so I was practicing for these really, really small amounts of time. And so I had to start to learn then how to practice more efficiently because I had so little time. And so my teacher in high school was really helpful too in teaching me how to practice more efficiently. Um, and then when I got to Oberlin, yeah, my teacher there also, I mean, that's kind of what he does in general. He's really great at teaching his students, yeah, lots of things, but how to practice efficiently is one of them. And yeah, I started seeing connections between what he was telling me was efficient practice and what I was learning in my neuroscience and psychology classes about, like, this is how the brain learns most efficiently. I was like, oh, these match. That's a good thing.
Yeah, nice. That's back to the 2 minutes thing. That's also a very good exercise in efficiency. You know,
Yep,
you get two
totally.
minutes, go.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's something I do now. I'll put on an interval timer to go off every 3 minutes, and I have to switch what I'm practicing every 3 minutes, which is
Right.
great practice strategy for a lot of reasons. But one of the things, it makes you be really, really efficient and really clear on what you're trying to get done in those 3 minutes.
Yeah, and that's sufficient. You know, there's always if you hear the stories of I practiced like 6 hours, I practiced like 12 hours a day.
Right.
Okay, let's do 3 minutes.
Right, exactly. And like that, people that practice, 9 hours a day, 12 hours a day, like that is, don't do that. Like that's so not how our brains work. Our brains really need breaks and really need rest. And the research is clear. Like we make the most progress while we're taking breaks, which is so hard to wrap your mind around. And while you're doing like a big long practice session like that, it can feel like you're getting a lot done, but you really aren't.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, like, and often people that are used to practicing for that long, they can't actually distill it down to just 3 minutes. What are you trying to get done in those
Right.
3 minutes? Because they're used to practicing really mindlessly and wasting a lot of time, and they don't actually know what they're trying to do,
Yeah.
And so even just the process of thinking, okay, what do I want to try to do in this 3 minutes is useful in and of itself.
Yes. Yeah. 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 And is there like it doesn't? There's not a minimum required amount of minutes before you start learning. Basically, it's not like, or is there?
No, I mean, like, yeah, you can start learning instantly. I think sometimes a lot of musicians feel like, well, I have to get into it first. Like, I need to, like
Mhm.
that whole people use different language, but like, I can't get into, I have to get into it first before I can actually start making progress. And when that's the case, usually either you're not clear at all about what you're trying to do, and so you kind of have to find your way there, and it's much more efficient to think that through before you start playing.
Mhm.
Because most people, if they're pressed, they can actually tell you what they want to do, right? They
Mhm.
just don't take the time to think first.
Yes.
And people often feel like, yeah, you have to get into it first because whatever you're practicing, like, you don't really know how it goes. You're not very comfortable with it. And you got to like play it a bit before you're like, oh, okay, I know what I'm doing now. But that sort of work of getting to know the music and playing it a bit and getting comfortable with it, like that's done way better off the instrument than on the instrument,
Yes.
either through like mental practicing or singing or listening to recordings or something like that. Like it's way more efficient to do it off the instrument.
Mhm.
Um, but it's just a different mindset. It's a different way of thinking about practicing because we think that we're only practicing when we're actually physically like playing the instrument, right? Which is also not true.
Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah, I'm already like I have to keep myself a little bit centered, but we'll get back to all of those things.
Yeah.
Um, you also have a book.
Yes.
Uh, of course, we're gonna link everywhere to all that stuff. But you also share like the appendix on your website with all the practicing strategies and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So my book came out last summer, which is hard to believe that it's like a real thing in the world. But yeah, I one thing I really wanted to do when I was writing the book is have all the practice strategies that I talk about in the whole book, like as like an easy PDF that people could just like download or print out or whatever to have with them when they're practicing. And so the publisher, Oxford University Press, said that I could make that freely available on my website, which is awesome. So yeah, it's just a free download. I don't even ask for your email. I hate the whole gatekeeping, like give me your email and then I'll send you a free download. Like, no, just go download it. So it's there for people to download and just yeah, keep with them.
Yeah, nice, nice, very nice. There are some things I wanted to touch upon. Like I saw the concept of overlearning.
Yeah.
That's one I didn't know yet.
Hmm.
Is that something you can elaborate about
Yeah,
on a
sure.
little bit?
So overlearning is just a fancy word for practicing something enough until you can do it pretty automatically.
Right,
And I think we all do that. We've all experienced that as musicians, right? That you want to be able to, I don't know, say play your scales like really easily and fluently, and you can play them in any key, and you don't really have to think about the fingering or whatever. And to get to that point, that's called overlearning.
right.
Um, and we do that well in some regards. Like I think like with the example of scales, like most people know, like, yeah, you got to know your scales cold, like, you don't even want to think about them. But then other things, we tend not to take that same viewpoint. Like if I'm a classical musician, right? So like what I practice is really different than what a jazz musician is going to practice because I'm practicing to like recreate something that somebody else wrote.
Mhm.
Um, but you know, a lot of times we will feel like if you're trying to work something out, like, okay, it's not working, it's not working, it's not working. And then you got, oh, okay, I can do it now. And then you move on to something else, like, no, 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 wait. You only got that right once. You got it wrong like a million times. Why do you think you have that now? No, you don't. You have to do it a bunch of times, right? You have to overlearn it essentially. So the right way feels really automatic rather than, the wrong way feeling automatic, which is what it is until you
Yeah,
figure it out and then you overlearn it.
yeah. Yeah, it's also the same for me. Like you pick up some of these strategies, or you're in your own practicing stuff. You just notice stuff that works, and
Yep.
then you come across like the research, which
Yep.
basically just confirms that,
Confirmed.
oh, I was doing the right thing. Like
Right.
when I was practicing that I also had like I need to do it 4 times correctly in a row,
Mhm.
and then I can bump it up like one click, or like 4 beats per minute. And then
Yeah.
if you make a mistake, you go back to zero.
Yep.
So that whole consequence thing, like if you get something wrong,
Yep.
you got to do
Right.
it this many times correctly in a row, and then you can move on. And so
Right.
that's basically
Exactly.
that.
No, that's great. And I think a lot of people have intuited this, like you said, but it's nice to have research to be like, yes, I'm doing the right thing. And also with, the overlearning of, okay, you have to get it right a certain number of times in a row, otherwise you go back to zero. Like that can be kind of a frustrating process,
Mhm.
right? If you mess up and you go back to zero. But for me and what I've seen with my students is if you understand what the brain needs, then it's easier to kind of stick with that and
Mhm.
understanding like, okay, I have to do this overlearning because I don't want to have to be worrying about this. I don't want to have to think about this. I want to just be able to do this. And this is what my brain needs. Okay, I'll stick with these repetitions that are driving me up the wall,
Yes.
kind of thing.
Yeah. It's for I've noticed a little bit in the more younger students that it can also be a fun game.
Exactly.
Like I need to get like to this goal, and then oh man,
Yep.
gotta do it again. Oh man, gotta do it again. So
Right.
it can
Right.
be sort of enjoyable.
Exactly. No, I agree. And with kids, I absolutely make it into a game. And I try to make it into a game even with my older students.
Mm,
And also with, I mean, what we were just talking about with taking breaks and doing things for 3 minutes and stuff. Like, I think a lot of people when they're when they're doing overlearning, they'll do mindless repetitions and it's just like over without actually thinking about it and without actually taking a break. And it's a lot more enjoyable and it will stick with you better if you don't do that. If you do, like a handful of repetitions, go do something else, then come back and do some more. It's more challenging, it's more fun, but also will stick with you
yeah.
better. So
So
there's lots of ways to make it, yeah, not such a slog.
yes, yeah. And that's the interleaved practice.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there something like getting to a point of I don't know if it's the right word, like, but satiety. So it's I had the feeling that when, yeah, it really feels full in my head. Like I
Yeah,
keep making mistakes, and I can't do it
right.
any other, not one more time, I just have to do something else. Is that like a natural stopping point for
Yeah,
as a signal to go do something else?
exactly. Yeah. When you get to that point and you just feel like your brain is full, like that is your brain telling you, like, stop, I need a break, go do something else. Because our brains need breaks to process. And actually, if you've gotten to that point, that means you should have taken a break like a while ago.
Oh, it's
It's just
already too
like
late.
yeah, I mean, it's not too late. Like, definitely
Well,
take a break now. But like, yeah, I mean, you should have taken a break a while ago. That you don't really want to necessarily get to that point. It's kind
right.
of like they say, once you notice you're thirsty, like you're already dehydrated. You should have been
Yes.
drinking water before. It's kind of the same thing. And so I mean, in my practicing, I take lots and lots of micro breaks, like 10 to 15-second breaks, where I just get a sip of water, look out the window, like, just space out and allow my brain to process. And because of that injury that I got when I was 15 that I was talking about, I never practiced for longer than 25 to 30 minutes without at least a 5-minute break. And I never practiced for more than an hour to an hour and a half, obviously with breaks every half an hour, before a much longer break, like at least an hour and a half, 2-hour break. So I rarely get to that point where it's just like, okay, no, I'm done. But the micro breaks is a more recent thing for me. The study that I talk about in the book about that only came out in 2021, so it's much more recent research.
Mhm.
And since then is, when I've been doing the the micro breaks, and I do notice a huge difference in how my brain feels, how much I retain, how it feels like at the end of a practice session. It doesn't, because I do know that feeling of like you just like burnt your brain out and you're just like you need to stop. But the micro breaks really help cut down on that. It's hard to remember to take them if you're
Right.
not used to it, right? But once you get used to it and you don't take your micro breaks, you're like, oh gosh, this feels bad. Oh, I haven't been doing my micro breaks. That's why.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah.
There's also a little point in the appendix that says keep going when you feel frustrated. So
Yeah.
that's like
Right.
a balance between
Right. Yeah, and that can be a really tricky balance, because if you sort of give up the minute you feel frustrated, like you're not really going to get anywhere, right?
Mhm.
Like that feeling of frustration, like in some ways your brain sort of needs that to kind of kick itself into high gear, right? And sometimes you can't really solve problems until you run into a wall,
Yeah.
right? And you have to find a creative way around that wall rather than just like banging into it over and over again, right? And you won't be forced into those creative solutions if you haven't run into the wall. And so frustration is a good thing, and I think I try to encourage my students to reframe the feeling of frustration as the feeling of learning.
Mhm.
That, when I notice this happening, like in a lesson they're getting really frustrated, I'll say, okay, what you're feeling right now, that's what learning feels like, so celebrate that rather than like trying to push that away. And that can really help people stick with it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, sometimes you get frustrated just because, yeah, your brain is full and you are tired and you need a break. And
Mhm.
it can be a judgment call, right?
Yeah.
Which it is. And so I think we need to simultaneously like increase our frustration tolerance and also take breaks.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
kind of both things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Being aware, first of all, like you said, like if you're feeling frustrated, like reframe it. It's not a bad thing. Don't associate
Right.
it with something bad. And then also
Yep.
recognizing like when it's getting too much, just take a break.
Just take a break. Exactly. And I think people, and I mean, this is kind of our culture in general. People have this feeling that if something is hard for them, it means they're not cut out for it, or
Mm,
like, like, oh well, I can't do this, maybe I shouldn't be striving for this. It's like, no, that's not true. Like every single person struggles with things, every single person gets frustrated. Take, the best person in any field that you really look up to, they will give you so many examples of times they were frustrated, they couldn't do it.
yeah,
Like that's necessary, so it doesn't mean anything negative about you, right, if
yeah,
you're experiencing that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I have a student like that. It's an older gentleman who just started the guitar. He really enjoys it.
Yeah.
And I have that feeling a lot with like the more, yeah, mature students
Uh-huh.
that's who just start out. Like they have the feeling that they should be better,
Yeah.
faster
Right.
than they're progressing. But it's like, it takes time.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and it's hard to make that point. Like, you know, even a kid also needs time to
Time.
progress and get better. And
Right. No, totally.
maybe, yeah, maybe it's something like as adults, you're used to just being able to do stuff and you already have skills and you think like, oh, I'm just gonna pick this up and it's gonna be
Right.
there.
And no,
Like,
it's not.
like I can drink a glass of water, you know.
Right, exactly. No, I think it's a lot of things. I think, yeah, you're right. Like as adults, we're used to just being able to do things and we forget what it feels like to be an absolute beginner and how hard that is.
Yeah.
I think also for adult musicians, like your ears far outpace your physical abilities. And so
Mm.
you can hear what you want, and it's so far away from what you're able to do that that distance feels kind of awful. Whereas in kids, usually their ears aren't really outpacing their physical ability. So like they don't care that they sound bad, right? You know, and you as the teacher are trying to like help their ears be like, you know, you need to sound better. The other thing too, what you said, like I should be better. Something I say more than anything else maybe is there is no should. There's just what is. Like,
Yeah.
you know, maybe you feel like you should be better, but like that's not. So like just accept, you know, the reality of where you are and work with that and you'll feel a lot better rather than being like, oh, I should be here and I'm only here. No, you're here. That's great that you're here. Like,
Yeah.
let's just keep moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. That's yeah. That's the stuff we try to
Right. But it's hard. I mean, it's hard to feel like you really can't do something as an
yeah.
adult,
Yeah.
especially when, you know, and usually people who pick up instruments as adults are very accomplished in the
Mhm.
other areas of their life, right? And so they're used to feeling very competent, very, you know, and if they can't do something, they can figure it out pretty easily. And suddenly there's this thing that like that skill set doesn't work for, and yeah, it doesn't feel good.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there sometimes I hear people say like specifically for technique, like technique is something personal. But like I guess it sort of is, but maybe there's maybe the ideal, like in terms of posture, movement, efficiency of movement, and something. But because of people's different builds or whatever, it doesn't really come out in that ideal way. Like, and how far should or could you go? Like, strive for that ideal, or just accept that a student holds the bow, or in my case, I'm a guitar player, like holds the pick in this or that way. Like,
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so there's like ergonomic principles, right, of like how all bodies work. And you're right, everybody's different and everybody has different things. And so what I'm always trying to balance in my teaching with students is that they understand these ergonomic principles and they're not doing anything that's going to like hurt
mm,
them, right? But also understanding that there's like variation between people and how their bodies work. So just as a specific example, it's where when you hold the bow, where you put your thumb on the bow in relation to the fingers on your hand is slightly different for every person because our hands are all different. And one thing that I do to kind of assess this in students is either like have them make a fist, like they're going to like punch somebody to see where the thumb ends up across their fingers, or to I have my water bottle here, have them hold a water bottle and see where does the thumb end up. For me, it's across from second finger, right? If I make a fist, my thumb goes way far across. Some people make a fist and it's more like
mhm,
this, right?
yeah,
And so for someone whose fist is more like this, like their thumb in relation to their fingers on the bow is going to be really different from mine because our hands are structured differently. It's a subtle difference. It's not like someone's going to be holding the bow with their thumb way out here and their fingers over here, and I'm going to be holding it like this, right? You know, but so as a teacher understanding like what are the sort of variations in someone's how their body physically is, but also what is ergonomically sound so they're not going to hurt themselves and they're able to play without extra tension and getting in their own way and stuff like that. So I
yeah,
think it's both personal and universal in a
yeah,
way, you know, it's both together.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, totally. Okay. Um, there's a couple of forks in the road I can take now. Um, Maybe first, like you mentioned, tension, and
Yeah.
you always hear like, of course, you need no excess tension, and in order to play faster, you need to relax, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But something that I also noticed was like when I was running into that wall of like my the limits of my abilities at that point, I was
Mhm.
tensing up and stuff like that, and
Yeah.
then I took the break or I did something different. I came back,
Mhm.
and in some way, my body had to get used to a certain tempo or speed,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
then it could relax and
Yeah.
play faster. So for me, it was more like breaking through
Uh-huh.
a certain point, and then I
Hmm.
could relax instead of I can relax and then I'm gonna a-
Yeah.
attain the speed. So I don't know if.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and the other thing too is I don't use the word relax anymore because I don't think it translates well because a lot
Mhm.
of people, when they hear the word relax, they think like zero muscle tone or something, that they're just like this blob, right? And like, you can't play that way. There has to be some muscle tone. And I think it can be really hard as a musician to kind of differentiate in your own body, like what is necessary muscle tone and what is too much and it goes over into tension, right? Like use the example of my water bottle, like it's full of water, it's relatively heavy right now. It's not like heavy, but like there has to be a certain amount of muscle tone like in my hand and my arm to hold it up, right? But I don't have to like grip the heck out of it in order to hold it, right? It's just a water bottle. But if I had zero muscle tone, like I'd drop it on the floor. And so with playing, like being able to differentiate, okay, what is the necessary muscle tone to do this thing I'm trying to do at the speed I'm trying to do it, and what is too much.
Mhm.
Um, but at the same time, yeah, your body, especially when you're trying to do stuff fast, like your body may not know what that feels like. And so it's going to, a lot of times when there's tension, when you're playing fast, especially, there's sort of co-contractions going on where it should be muscles like alternating with each other, right? Like,
Right.
so for string players, when you bow really fast, it should be your bicep and your tricep like working in alternation, how they're supposed to
Hmm.
work, rather than both of them being tight at the same time. And when you get that co-contraction of both of them, then it gets really tight and it gets hard to play. Um, but if the muscles don't really understand essentially what they're supposed to do and how to alternate in that way, they'll both try to do it sort of at the same time. It's like, nope, that doesn't work. And so yeah, it's figuring out, okay, how do I use these muscles in this really rapid way? And sometimes it's, using certain muscles incorrectly, like, for playing like a tremolo, for instance, so really, 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 really fast. People try to do it with a co-contraction with their bicep and their tricep, but actually, if you use the muscles in your back, then your bicep and your tricep are just relaxed, essentially, that they have the necessary muscle tone to hold your arm up in space. But other than that, they're not really doing anything. That's the muscles in your back. And those actually work a lot better to do that
Ah,
particular skill. Um, but for a lot of people, either you have to be told that, like I had to be told that by someone and figure it out, or you have to be someone who can kind of figure that kind of thing out. So it might be that it's like the wrong muscles altogether that are trying
yeah.
to do the thing you're trying to do. And yeah, I mean that's a whole can of worms of how
Yeah,
do you
yeah, yeah.
figure that out? And yeah.
No, but that's interesting. But the idea of getting used to a certain speed or tempo, that
Mhm.
is like that is a thing or not
Yeah, I
really?
mean, what came into my head immediately in my at NEC, I teach a class that I just finished teaching on music cognition and perception, and students have to do presentations at the end of the semester on whatever they feel like. And one group did this presentation on a paper that came out earlier this year that I knew of, but I hadn't read, where they had pianists learn this very fast it was alternating thirds, like 1 3
Mm.
2 4, like alternating thirds really, really fast. And it had them practice that to get it as fast as they could. And then they took this robot exoskeleton and put it on their hands that could move their fingers passively faster than is humanly possible, which is just like so cool. And they did that. They put this robot on people's fingers and like moved their fingers. And then after they'd done this training with the robot, they could then actually play it without the robot, like way faster than they were able to get to with practice. And they did the robot not just faster but slower. They were trying to look at this. And the conclusions, I mean, that study came out like just a couple months ago. It's brand new, but the
Okay.
conclusions from that study were that like the you reach a ceiling and your body needs to like to get past that, it has to feel what it's like to do it faster than humanly possible. I mean, the research was done by a robotics lab, so they're trying to like market this, I think. But it was just really interesting to think about that, like the body needs to, yeah, figure it out first before it can kind of break that ceiling. And they had the robot move their fingers slower than normal too. And I think a lot of times as musicians, we think, okay, I can figure it out really slow and that will translate to fast. And it won't
Hmm.
actually. And so yeah, it's just a lot of food for thought. The other thing that came into my mind reading that study is my teacher from undergrad used to talk to us about before you can do something well, you have to be able to do it. Like if you can't do it in the first place, how can you do it well?
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? And so what that sometimes translates into is doing it really sloppily first, just to figure out how to do it,
Hmm.
and then you can sort out the specifics.
Yeah.
Um, and so that kind of connects with what they found in this like robot hand thing. That yeah, I mean, because the body and the brain, the way they talk to each other, it's the body has to get used to the brain telling it what to do. And if it's something you've never done before at a speed you've never done it before, your body's like, what is this?
Yeah.
Right? And it does kind of have to get used to it and then kind of settle in a sense.
Yeah. 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 I heard a guitarist once sort of talk about this as well. He passed away now like years ago,
Mhm.
but he was someone who could play incredibly fast, and he
Mm.
also said like um, you try to clean things up at speed.
Yeah,
So of course you have the whole thing, the whole build up, so to speak. Like you practice
yeah,
slow and get it in your fingers, and then when you're ready to kick it up a notch, you take it at speed and you try to clean
right.
things up and work on it on that speed because yeah, it's sort of approaching the goal from
Both
two
sides.
sides. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think we as musicians in general spend way too much time practicing slow stuff, or sorry, stuff that we have to play fast, slow.
Yeah.
Um, because, and I mean, yes, you do have to do it slow. There's some coordination things, especially for me, like I cannot literally figure out how to coordinate it. If I'm doing it too fast, my brain like cannot process that much information. And so I have to do it slow to figure out, oh, okay, this is what I have to do. But then people tend to take a lot of time playing slow, and then you've learned one motor pattern that's like, individual movements, whereas they actually have to be like one continuous movement or like a bigger grouping of movements. And you have to totally relearn how to do it if you do it fast. And so if you learn it fast in small increments, right? So you can really refine it, but small increments, that tends to work better. And like you said, attacking it from both sides, not just the slow to the fast side, but also like from the fast side the other way.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Cool.
Yeah.
Um,
Fast is hard. That's sort of the moral of the story.
yeah. 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 It, there's not a lot of room for, well, there's no room for error if you have to play things fast. You know, you have
Right.
to be efficient and you can't
Right.
have any excess movement. But yeah,
Right.
the
I
only
mean, the
way
other thing
to,
too with what you just said, like when you play slow, you can think about everything you're doing. You
yeah,
do not have time for that when
yeah,
it's fast, right? You cannot think about every single thing. And if you're trying to, like, that is never ever gonna work,
yeah.
right? And so you're also practicing kind of faulty thinking when you're playing slow for too long, because you're not going to be able to use that when you play fast.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I also like to use the metronome or speeding things up as a way to gauge, like, okay, how well do you know it? Do you have to think
Notice.
about stuff,
Yeah,
or is there a point where you go like, okay,
right.
there's where you need to go back and
Right. Yep, that's a great point. Because yeah, you have to be on autopilot in a sense when you go
yeah,
fast. You have to let your body do it, and you can't have your brain trying to control every single note.
yes, yeah. That brings me to a different point. I heard you talk about like, which is also very interesting. The what you focus on is it should be more about what your goals or what you're trying to achieve and not thinking about the specifics of what your body needs to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So this falls under the category of attentional focus or internal versus
Right.
external focus. That, yeah, basically what the research has found is if you think too much about like the specific mechanics of, okay, I do this with my hand or my fingers or like whatever, is not going to work as well as if you think about like the goal of what you're trying to achieve or something outside your body or an analogy for how the movement should feel, because when you think too particularly about, okay, my fingers do this, blah blah blah, like you get in the way of the automatic processes that sort of self-coordinate your body that work way better than your brain ever will. And this is this sort of a trap I fall into, because my brain does do a pretty good job of controlling everything, but and so I feel like, okay, well, I can do a better job than like just letting my body do it, but like it's not true.
Hmm.
um and so, but also it, like as a musician, we do have to pay attention to really specific things with how we're using our body, right? To play precisely and not, be really, really sloppy. And so, yeah, the analogy piece of it, I think, is important, that like, if you're trying to refine your motion, going back to your question about like technique and like how we're using our bodies, like if you're trying to refine your motion, you do have to think about how you're using your body. But
Hmm.
if you can think about that in terms of an analogy, like it feels like, who knows what, rather than I do this with my finger, I do this with my wrist, that's going to work a lot better.
Yeah, yeah. It's just knowing that your body will figure things out, and
Right.
you just have to trust
Right.
that things will work out or straighten out. That's I think that's also just a helpful thing to just know that it exists.
Right.
You don't have to micromanage your.
You don't have to micromanage it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, an analogy that I use, speaking of analogies, an analogy I use for this to help people understand is like, if you're learning a new language, to speak a
Mhm.
new language, and you're talking with a native speaker and they say a word you've never heard before, you ask them to repeat themselves and they say it again and you repeat the sound, right? You listen to the sound and you try to mimic the sound. You don't ask them, well, what am I supposed to do with my tongue? What am I supposed to do with my lips? Like, and if first of all, they wouldn't be able to tell you, but if they could tell you, like, okay, you put your tongue behind your teeth and then you, like, what? You would never be able to pronounce the word that way. That would be so massively confusing. You just listen to the sound and you mimic the sound.
Yeah,
And I think everybody can sort of understand that, because we've all had the experience of trying to pronounce a word that is brand new to us, right? And you just listen to it and you're not thinking about, my lips do this, my tongue does this, my, whatever. And it's the same thing with playing.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a beautiful segue into what I had coming up next.
Great.
You also do research, or you're working in the field between music and language as well. You have
Yeah,
worked on some
yeah.
papers.
Yeah, I've published some papers on I've co-authored some papers on music and early language acquisition, and
Yeah.
the sort of overlaps between, yeah, music and language, which is super fascinating and totally separate from the practice stuff.
Yeah, yeah. But like in one of the conclusions, it came up that for children, or
Mhm.
I don't know until what age or something, that actually language is like a subset, or like it's language and music is basically the same thing.
Yeah, so this comes from, I was a co-author on a paper that we published in 2012 with Tony Brandt, the composition professor at Rice that I was talking about.
Right.
He had this idea that, like, you always hear like music is a language, music is a universal language, that kind of thing. And he was like, no, I think it's backwards. I think language is a type of music, and that's how we first experience it as infants, because a baby is born, they don't know that language has meaning. They just hear the sounds, right? And so he had this idea that like language is a type of music, and if we do listen to it that way as infants, and if we can't listen to it that way, like we have trouble learning language later. And so me and Tony and Bob, our other co-author, we went into the research to see, is there any actual support for this crazy idea that Tony had? And
Yeah.
there's a lot of support for it. There's a lot of overlap between music and language. There's a lot of research that shows that like infants that have difficulty kind of hearing the music of language, if you will, have more difficulty with language skills later, with reading and writing and things like that. Yeah, it's fascinating that the brain, as adults, it's very clear. Music is this, language is this, and we don't
Yeah.
really confuse them. But as infants, they're very entangled in our brains, and our brains respond to them in very similar or identical ways, which is super cool.
Yeah. Does that have any implications on how we should approach studying music or languages, or?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest takeaway for me as a musician from this research is like music education is important. Like it helps people. And there's lots of research that musicians have much better sort of language skills, hearing skills when it comes to language, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And that we learn language better when it's like musical. So for instance, I think everybody knows everybody talks to babies in this kind of sing-songy
Right.
way. It's called infant-directed speech, or motherese is the older term for it. But it's universal that in every culture that's been studied, people talk to babies in this kind of sing-songy way that really emphasizes the music of language, right? That it emphasizes, I mean, there's pitches in how we
Mhm.
talk, right? My voice just went up when I said that to emphasize that word, right? So if I were to ask you a question, like the only way you'd know that is my voice going up at the end, right? And so there's
Yeah.
music, there's pitches in language, there's rhythm in language, and when you talk to babies in this sing-songy way, it brings out that music in a way that we don't do when we talk to adults, and it facilitates language learning. And there's a lot of ideas as to why it facilitates language learning. But it does. Infants also like, I mean, we sing to infants in kind of a different way. We play them different music than maybe
Hmm.
adults. And infants sort of respond to sort of infant-directed singing better than like adult-directed singing. So infants are very attuned to these musical aspects of language, and it helps them learn language in cultures where music is more emphasized than it is like in Western cultures, right? Like in Western cultures, it's all about like language. That's what's focused on in
Yeah.
school. When kids like, little kids will say things like, I go to the store rather than I went to the store, right? And the parents will correct them. And if little kids sing songs and they sing it wrong, like we tend not to correct them, right? It's just like, oh, it's cute, they're singing. But in some cultures, they do kind of correct them with the singing, and they treat learning that their culture's songs and music like the same as language. It's given the same importance. And so those kids reach certain milestones earlier than Western kids do, because the music is there sort of supporting the language learning,
Right, right, right. That's very interesting.
which is cool. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Maybe a more general question, like, do we have any idea when like this separation starts to occur between, okay, this is now language and this is now
This is
music?
music. Yeah, I mean, all of us are born as babies with the ability. Well, this is okay. Let me take two steps back. So, all languages have different sounds in them, right? And there are certain sounds that, like, there's certain sounds in English that are like irrelevant in other languages, and
Mm,
there's certain sounds in other languages that are irrelevant in English. So, like, for instance, in college, I took Russian for a semester, and there were these vowel sounds that were like back in the throat and like further back in the throat that were like, I guess I could hear the difference, but like not really. And
yeah.
they made a big, I mean, to a Russian speaker, they're very obvious. To me as an English speaker, I was like, what is that? Because those sounds are not relevant in English, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so all babies are born with the ability to hear all speech sounds in all languages, because like as a baby, like you don't know where you're going to be born, right? You don't know what you're going to have to be able to hear. And so the brain is able to process all those different sounds just fine. And then as you kind of get enculturated in your native culture, your brain learns that, oh, well, these sounds never come up, or they mean the same thing. Essentially, they're not relevant. And so
Hmm.
the brain kind of starts filtering that out. And that up through 6 months, we can hear basically everything. And then after 6 months, the brain starts sort of filtering things out. And by the time someone's like a year old, they're hearing language in terms of like those speech sounds like an adult
Okay.
from that culture. The same thing is true with music. So in like Western music, we tend not to have like microtones, for
Hmm.
instance. But in cultures that have what we in the West would term like microtones, Western adults are really bad at hearing those. Babies can hear them just fine.
Yeah.
In most Western like folk music, it's in very regular meters, right? But in like Eastern European, a lot of folk songs are like in 5/8 or 7/8 or something
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that. American adults, for instance, have a really hard time with that they can't feel that changing beat structure, but infants can hear it like regardless of culture. And same thing, like as they get older, if they're like an American infant, let's say, they lose the ability to kind of hear that. And so that kind of funneling of what you're able to hear happens between like 6 months and 12 months of age for language things, for music things. I mean, there's things that continue to develop through about age 10, 12 in both music and language. Um, but once babies essentially discover that language has meaning,
Mm.
that's when it really starts to diverge around 1 year old. Once baby, oh, that has a meaning to it. Okay, then the brain kind of really latches on to that. And I don't know that anybody studied specifically like, okay, when are music and language like totally separate? Because they're never really totally separate. Like you can
Hmm.
do experiments with adults in lots of ways to show that they still do overlap in the brain. We just don't experience it that way. But it's mostly between ages 6 months and 12 months that the brain is really doing a lot of this like perceptual narrowing to
Yeah.
kind of zero in on, okay, this is what's relevant in my culture that I'm surrounded with these sounds. This is what's not relevant. And then it continues to be defined like in early childhood, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I also heard you mentioning like in children that there's a lot of pruning going on. So
Right.
pruning of connections. So that's basically that.
Right, that's basically that. Yeah, we're born with a lot more connections than we have later in life because, again, we don't know we're going to be born. The brain doesn't know what it's going to have to do, right?
Yeah.
And then as the brain kind of experiences the world and the culture that you're born in, the brain, essentially sees, okay, this is relevant, this is not relevant, and it takes away the things that aren't relevant. Because, I mean, we're limited by the size of our skull, right? And it does,
Mm.
grow, right, from a baby to an adult. But like we are limited by this sort of bony canister that our brain has to live in. And so there's limited real estate. And so the brain doesn't keep things around that are not relevant for what that person's experiencing, which isn't to say you can't learn it later, right? If I had
Hmm.
stuck with learning Russian, eventually I would have learned how to hear those sounds, right? I only took it for a semester, so nope, I didn't. But if I had went and lived in Russia and that kind of thing, like I would have been able to relearn that. But my brain took those connections away when
Yeah.
I was a baby because it learned, oh well, this isn't relevant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's all very interesting.
Right. It's very cool. I mean, it's such a smart system,
Yeah.
right? Like, our brains are born, we're not born as a blank slate. Like that is not true.
Hmm.
But we're born with the capacity to learn anything. And the fact that the brain just like essentially notices through statistical learning what's relevant, what's not relevant, prunes away the connections that aren't relevant, strengthens the connections that are relevant. It's very cool.
Yeah, and it's all self-regulating, you don't have to do
You're right.
anything for it. It just happens on its
Right.
own.
As long as there's input, right? As long
Yeah.
as there's input, the brain does it. If there's no input, then the brain has nothing to do anything with. But as long as there's input, then the brain, yeah, does it itself.
Yeah. And like in terms of like learning theories for music, you have the different Korai and
Yeah.
Suzuki and whatever.
Mhm.
There's also like a music learning theory. I don't know if you're
Huh.
familiar with that. A lot of these things are rote first or note first. So
Oh,
basically, a lot
see.
of uh, listening and
Yeah.
the reading stuff that comes later. Or
Right. Read first. Yeah.
yeah, is
Right.
there is there an optimal approach or?
Yeah, I mean, I have a very strong opinion on this that's somewhat backed up by research and somewhat backed up by personal experience. So I was a Suzuki kid growing up. So I learned to play by ear for the first 3 years of my playing life. I didn't know how to read music, and then I learned how to read music. And I am a really strong proponent of learning by ear, that it doesn't matter what you're going to do later if you're going to be, I mean, these days, almost everything I learn is from reading
Mhm.
music, right? But it doesn't matter. Like it's things are going to be better if you learn by ear from the beginning. And what I've noticed myself is that in myself, in other people that learn by ear, Suzuki or jazz or bluegrass or what have you, like any kind of by ear experience as a kid, is that people memorize more easily. People's ears are more sensitive. They can hear things in sound and intonation. And that they just have more awareness when they learn by ear versus people who learn reading, there's that sort of lack of ear awareness that can be learned. Obviously, it can, but it seems to be slower to develop. The research to back this up is in professional musicians. They have found that in professionals, but not amateurs, when they test them like back to back, is that in professionals, when a professional plays something silently, so there's no sound, the auditory cortex is activated. The auditory cortex is only supposed to be activated when you're hearing stuff. But people are playing silently and the auditory cortex is activated. You also see the flip side, so that when people listen to something that they know how to play and they're totally still, the motor cortex is activated. The motor cortex is only supposed to be activated when you're moving, but people, they like monitor their hands with motion capture or whatever. They're not moving. And the motor cortex is active in the very specific way it would be when they actually play. So there's a study that I'm thinking of that was done on pianists, and when people would play like a note with their thumb, the thumb area was active. When people would play a note with their pinky, the pinky area was active. So it's very specific activation. And again, they're not moving. That's not supposed to be happening, right? But it is. And so there's this what this comes to is that there's this motor auditory co-activation that is happening in the brains of professional musicians. There's also research that's been done looking at teaching people. There's only a tiny bit of research on this, teaching people by ear from the beginning and putting them in a scanner, and you do see the beginnings of this auditory motor co-activation in those people that have never read music. For those studies that I'm thinking of, they use this fMRI sort of cello that people can like play lying on their back, and it's not really a cello, it has a really tiny bow. And they teach them to play like a very, very short things, like this 5-note pattern, but they're learning to play, right? And you do see this auditory motor kind of co-activation starting to happen. What I have not seen done yet, and this is a study I've wanted to do for forever, is what I think is probably happening in people who learn to read music from the beginning is that the motor cortex gets connected to the visual cortex,
Right.
and less the auditory cortex. And that when you learn by ear, it's the auditory cortex and the motor cortex talking to each other, which is what you want. But when you learn with music, it's the motor cortex and the visual cortex. And so the auditory cortex is like not so much part of it. Nobody's done that research yet. I want to do it. I want somebody to do it, to take essentially two groups of kids that have never played any instruments, right? Scan their brains before they do anything, and then teach one group by ear, one group with the music, and then, see what happens over a period of time.
Yeah.
There's also research on adult, like jazz musicians versus classical musicians, looking at their ability to sort of hear things, essentially. And what they find is, in general, the jazz musicians outperform the classical musicians in being able to detect small differences in pitch or timing or rhythm or like things like that. Because you guys as jazz musicians, like you do a lot more of your learning by ear, whereas classical musicians were like looking at the page.
Mm-hmm.
And so the sort of superiority of that kind of training, of really honing your ear and learning by listening, shows up also in the abilities that adult musicians have based on how they were trained. So even though I spend my practice days looking at music, I'm a huge, huge proponent of everybody should learn by ear from the beginning. Doesn't matter what you're going to do later. It will serve you. It will serve you well. So that's my soapbox issue on that.
Well, we have the perfect stage for
Yeah.
for preaching ear training as a
No,
transcription channel.
it's so important. And it's just so important. There's no reason you have to read music from the
Mm-hmm.
beginning. Music is not something you look at. Music is something you listen to,
Yeah.
right? And when you're on stage, like what is telling you what's going on? Are you playing well? How do you communicate with people? Your ears. It's not like, sure, you can see people, but like it's your ears, right? And so that is what really has to be trained.
Yeah. Is there? Well, of course I have more questions coming up. um, Maybe a very specific one, like ear training is, if you say ear training, a lot of the times you also say singing.
Yeah.
Is that, I know it's effective, but is there also research on that that shows that there's a connection between?
Yeah, there is. So there's the research on singing in terms of like neurological stuff is much less than research on other stuff. But
Hmm.
um, basically, yeah, what research has found is like if you are sort of singing what you're trying to play, that really facilitates being able to play it, being able to play in tune, that kind of thing. Singing in general doesn't seem to do much, but like singing what you are trying to play really does.
Yeah.
Um, in one of the fMRI cello studies that I was just referencing, they did one with, they just taught people from scratch how to play this. They did another one with professional cellists who had to play this funny little fMRI cello. But they had them in that one, they had them play the cello, but also sing what they were playing because they wanted to see, is there overlap in brain areas that are doing these things? Um, and what they found was that in the people that there was sort of more activation in singing areas and sort of more overlap between playing and singing, that they played more in tune and
Mm.
they just scored better on pitch based things. And so there was, yeah, when we discussed it actually in my class I'm teaching right now, and the students were like, oh, this is why we do ear training. Like they should have told us about this study. I was like, well, it just came out recently. So but yeah, like singing is really important for instrumentalists, and we tend not to want to sing, right? Because
Yeah.
our voices aren't trained, right? But it really does make a difference in terms of intonation, what you can hear, your control over your instrument. And also like singing out loud, but also audiation, like singing inside your head. That's a really important skill too. And they're separate from each other. Just because you can sing out loud doesn't mean that you can necessarily audiate well. It's a separate skill that you have to work on. But
Right.
that's also really important. And people that are able to audiate more clearly are able to also play more in tune.
Yeah.
Um, so honing both of those things is important.
And that's just, as anything, a matter of trying again and repeating, and the audiation stuff. Like, of course,
Right.
singing, that's it's obvious when you're doing it, you're singing
Yeah.
something, but the mental aspect, the mental practicing, that's more
Right.
abstract, and your mind, it's almost like a meditation, or mindfulness thing. Like, you really have to focus and not get lost in something, or it's
Yeah, no, it's hard. And I mean, something I always talk about when audiation comes up is something called aphantasia, which I talk about a little bit on my channel and a little bit on the book. Aphantasia was only identified by the scientific community. It's not discovered because I'm sure it's been part of human existence for forever, but only identified, I think, in like 2015 or something, like relatively recently. And it was defined as the inability to see things in the
mm,
mind's eye. But more recently, like within the last couple of months, it's been redefined to be a multi-sensory thing. You can have aphantasia in a variety of ways. And I bring it up because I have visual and auditory aphantasia. I don't actually hear
okay.
anything in my mind. It's dark and quiet in there. It's very hard to explain this, especially to musicians. They're like, you don't hear anything? How do you audiate then? And so like I cannot conjure up the sound of, say, a piano or a viola. Like I can't conjure up that sound, but I know what it sounds like. I can't conjure up the sound of a scale in my mind, but I can imagine a scale and know that I'm hearing a scale, even though I'm not literally hearing anything. It's very,
Right.
very hard to describe to people. But that was a skill that I really had to practice because I can't hear anything. And so I had to work on, okay, do I know that, like, if I'm trying to sing like the first three notes of a scale, do I know that I know what those are, even though I don't like literally hear
Hmm.
anything?
Right.
And so, yeah, like you said, you have to be really focused. You have to be really mindful. I also find it really helpful when people are trying to get better at actually any mental practice skills, not just the auditory ones, but the physical ones, is to go back and forth between doing it. Like, so if we're talking about audiation, like just start with a single note, like play a middle C, on a piano or something, and then try to hear that middle C or know that that's what you're hearing and sort of go back and forth in that way. And then like make it bigger, maybe play three notes. And then can you hear those three notes and, broaden it over time.
Yeah.
But the going back and forth between actually doing it and imagining it can be really helpful because it is a difficult skill.
Yeah.
Some people it's not. Some people they can hear really easily. That's not me. So I
No,
had to work on it.
that's very interesting. That's for people who can do stuff well without any effort,
Mhm.
they've never had to
Right.
overcome that problem, and
Right.
they most of the time they can't really give advice on how to improve. But
Right.
so this is very very
Right.
helpful. I'm sure for me as well. It's I noticed that it has gotten better.
Yep.
I don't have aphantasia, I don't think, but
That's the thing. Like you start being like, when I first read about it, I was like, I read about it in terms of visual, and I was like, do I see things? Because again, I know, like for instance, I know what my mom looks like. Can I
right.
conjure up an image of her in my mind? No, absolutely not. But it's very weird. It's very confusing, and it's hard to. I mean, the way the other story I tell to help people, because often when I talk about this, people start having like a crisis, like an identity crisis, like, oh my God, can I do the way that I discovered this is my mom had posted a picture of her apple pie on Facebook, like around like Thanksgiving or something like that. And I've eaten my mom's apple pie like a million times in my life, right? And I saw this picture she posted on Facebook, and I felt like I could literally like smell and taste the pie, even though obviously I knew that I wasn't smelling or tasting the pie, right? But I think we've had that experience before of like you see a picture of something and you can like smell it or taste it.
Mhm.
And like and this was around the time I was reading about aphantasia, and I was like, oh, wait, that's a really different experience. Like, I know I'm not smelling it. I know I almost said hearing it. I know I'm not tasting it. But like the experience of seeing that picture and like tasting it or smelling it was very close to the actual experience of
Right.
tasting or smelling the actual pie. Whereas my experience of imagining what something looks like is very different than vision. My experience of imagining what something sounds like is very different than actually hearing it. I do know what things look like and sound like in my mind, but I'm not hearing or seeing them.
Hmm.
And so that's what made me realize, oh, that my experience of this is quite different than the real sense of doing this thing.
Right, right. It's more visceral, like the
Yeah,
sensation of
yeah. Right, yeah, smell and taste is much more visceral. And like I can imagine like when I imagine moving, like my kinesthetic imagination is very close to actually doing it, and that does feel very sort of
yeah.
visceral. But the sight and the sound is much more conceptual, and it isn't like
Right.
grounded in the bodily sensations of doing it or
Right,
hearing it,
right, right.
experiencing it or whatever.
But I think maybe the most important takeaway is if you do or you don't have it, doesn't matter. You can still
Right.
train
You
it
can
and
still
get better
figure
at
out
it.
how to do it. Yeah. And I mean, the hardest thing for me was figuring out how to hear quality of sound,
Okay.
because that is much more um it's just much less tangible than like a specific pitch, I feel like.
Hmm.
And I found for me trying to imagine quality of sound that I really had to think of like descriptive words. Like if
Okay.
I was trying to hear the quality of sound on like a specific note that I was playing, like I had to come up with descriptive words for myself to describe how I wanted that to sound. And then I was more able to like hold on to the concept of, okay, yes, that's the quality of sound, even though I don't literally hear it, like I do know what it is.
Yeah. 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 That's interesting. It
Yeah.
kind of um, it reminds me of I also had it when I was practicing, and I have students ask me stuff. It's not specifically about ear training or audiation or something, but knowing or not being sure if you're doing something correctly. Like,
Right.
am I doing this correctly? Am I thinking about this correctly? Like, whatever your tools are to grasp a concept or think about
Yeah.
something or process something, it's go for it. It's not
Right.
like there's
Right.
one golden standard and that's the right way to.
Right. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. And with I mean, I hear that a lot too from students. Like, I don't know if I am imagining this correctly. And like the way I imagine pitch, I'm sure is very different than a lot of musicians because I can't hear anything. But also that's where like going back and forth between the instrument and imagining can really help.
Right.
Because sometimes, I mean, certainly when I started to work on mental practicing just as a general concept, not just the auditory aspect, like it wasn't totally clear. Like, am I able to feel what this actually feels like? Am I able to imagine this? And like trying to imagine it and then doing it on the instrument and being like, oh, okay, like, parts of this I imagined correctly, but there's these other parts that I totally forgot to imagine, or my imagination was like not calibrated right. And so taking the information from the instrument and then putting it back in my head and trying to make it match better, and then being like, okay, I think that's right now. And then doing it on the instrument, and being like, oh yeah, that does match better, but there's this, little difference. So that calibration between real and imagined, I think, is really important as
Right.
well, that you're using your instrument to help improve your imagination. It's not just imagining like in a vacuum without any
Yes.
outside input.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. First step, try to repeat what you hear in the real
Right,
world, and then
right. Yeah.
yeah. Is there we run this channel with the two of us and my companion. He has great ears,
Mhm.
great audiation skills as well. But he says himself like I can't sing at all. Like
Uh-huh.
keeping a pitch is that I just can't.
Huh.
He hears everything, but he can't hold a pitch or whatever. So he also hates giving the advice that people have to sing in order to do ear
Hmm.
training.
Yeah.
Is there an alternative or something that people could do to still develop or develop their ears
Right. That's a good
while
question. I
singing?
mean, I'm not a very good singer either, but to me it's a vocal control issue
Right.
that sometimes when people can't sing, like it's yeah, it's a vocal control issue or breath issue, or this is a question for a voice teacher. But like some students have a much easier time like whistling, for instance.
Mm,
They can whistle things that they can't sing, or hum. Sometimes people can hum things that they can't sing. And so whenever a student is having difficulty singing, either like actual difficulty or they seem self-conscious about it and they like don't want to do it, yeah, I ask them, okay, can you hum it or can you whistle it? And whistling is really different than singing, right? And so
right.
sometimes that can be a really good alternative, that people can whistle. I can't whistle really at all, but some people can whistle like quite well,
Yeah.
things that they can't actually sing. So that could be a way to do it as well.
But the element of producing the sound is an important part of developing the ear.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I I hesitate to say yes, definitely, absolutely, because there isn't like enough research. I mean, the research that exists does does indicate that the actual production of sound and singing is really important. But like, I'm sure there's more people like the person you do the channel with, who their audiation is great and there's a production issue, because we do know that like perception and production are different from each other, just in terms of everything, not just singing, but like speaking. Like production and perception are really different. And science hasn't studied everybody, right? And so my guess is, yeah, there's probably a subset of people that have great audiation skills and their production doesn't match that at all. And it doesn't matter, but my guess is it's a smaller subset of the population. But again, we don't know because nobody studied that, and probably scientists don't know that that's a thing, and they should
Yeah.
study,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So yeah, but yeah, try whistling. That would be my
That's a good one.
suggestion.
That's a good one. Uh, in terms of we run a transcription channel
Uh-huh.
basically, and is there, I don't know if you know this, but is there like a difference between writing something by hand on paper and
Mhm.
then checking if it's correct, or typing it into the computer and getting like instant feedback, like, oh, I matched the pitch, I'm good to go. I know
Yeah.
this
Oh,
might
that's a great question. That's very cool. I would be very surprised if there's specific research on that. But brains in general, you learn more when there is a delay in getting feedback, and when you have to kind of struggle a bit. It's harder to write it down on paper versus just putting it into
Mhm.
music notation software and it tells you right away if you're right or wrong, right?
Yeah.
And we tend to, like we were talking about earlier, we tend to like to avoid struggle because it doesn't feel good. But like the struggle of writing it down on paper and then having to check your work and having that delay is actually useful and productive if you're trying to get better at your transcription skills. If you're trying to make a transcription really quickly because you got to get it down on paper, because put it in the music notation software, like, you know, but if you're trying to improve those skills and being able to translate what you hear into reproducing it or into notation, you're going to be better off writing it down because it's harder.
Right.
And we tend to learn more things when they're harder, even though nobody likes that.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's harder, it's probably better for you.
It's probably better for you. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the other thing too with like music notation software is like, for instance, if you've understood the rhythm wrong and you put a note value in and it's too long for the measure, like it's not going to work, right? It's not going
Yeah.
to put that in. And so then you'll know instantly, oh, this is wrong without having to think about it because it tells you that it's wrong versus writing it out. Like you have to realize yourself, oh, wait, I can't put a quarter note in that measure because I only have 1/8 note's worth left. Like, okay. And you have to go through that thought process, and that thought process is valuable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's easy. Computers can take a lot of the you can outsource a lot of stuff to the
Exactly.
computers. So
Yeah, and it's really dangerous. I mean, like what people are doing these days with outsourcing everything to AI, that AI is doing all their thinking for them. Like there's so many issues with AI aside from that, but like do you really want to outsource your brain to a machine? Your brain is like literally the most valuable thing you have. You need to protect your brain and you need to sort of build up your brain and exercise your brain. Like that's like the most important thing you have as a human being is your brain. Like do not outsource that.
yeah, yeah. The struggle to fight off convenience is getting
Right.
harder and harder.
Yeah. Nope, totally. I agree.
Yeah. Musical memory, like transcribing and getting longer and longer phrases
Yeah.
in your mind. I'm guessing that's also something you just have to train and work up to. Like you start with maybe, I don't know, two notes, a bar, two bars, and that is that like a way
Yes.
to
Yes. I mean, yes, you do have to train that, but also there's ways to do it that are more effective and less effective. So, for
okay.
instance, brains really don't like information that feels like it exists in a vacuum, that feels like
Mm,
random notes or random rhythms or random like whatever. And so sometimes, I mean, I don't do transcriptions as a classical player, but I do memorize music and it's kind of similar because, you know, you're trying to memorize longer and longer things. And sometimes people try to memorize like just like a note at a time or a bar at a time or whatever. And that's like not musically sound. Like the
right.
phrase is longer than a bar, or like the motive is maybe like a bar and a beat or something like that. And so if you're trying to learn things in units that aren't musically meaningful, your brain's going to have a really hard time holding on to it because it feels random, right? But if you can, like, if you're doing a transcription or you're trying to like remember something, if you can see larger patterns, like, oh, this is the same musical motive, it's just transposed, or oh, this is basically a scale with like a couple notes missing or something like that. Like the
Yeah.
more that you can see bigger patterns and bigger structures, the better you're going to do at holding on to it. And so part of getting better at musical memory is getting better at recognizing patterns and structures and how do these individual notes and rhythms fit into this larger thing, because that's what the brain needs. And the richer you can kind of make that structure that you're embedding everything into, the better. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is that people tend to memorize sort of like just like in order, right? Like
Hmm.
from the beginning, like here we go, and we add on. And what happens then is the beginning feels really good, and the further you go, like it feels less and less secure, right? And you don't know what it is. And so it's also important to be sort of testing yourself and working on things in like out of context or out of order so that you have it in a much richer way than just like from the beginning to the end. An example I often give is the alphabet. Like we have the alphabet memorized, but like if I asked you right now what comes first, T or S, like most people would, I don't know, I have to say the whole alphabet, right? You don't actually like know it.
Yeah.
And when you're trying to remember music, you want to know it,
Yeah.
especially if it's something that you're going to be improvising on, right? That you learn the tune and now you're going to manipulate it in some way. You can't really manipulate it really well if you don't like know it, right? That you just know, yes, I don't know what comes first, S or T, but like you just know, like, okay, that's first, like you know it inside and out. And to know it at that really deep level, you need to sort of test yourself out of context or out of order or something like that, that you can kind of start anywhere, that you don't just start at the beginning of it, but okay, can you start at the beginning of the fourth phrase and sort of know exactly what's there? That also helps as well, especially if the fourth phrase is embedded into this larger structure of, I know it's the fourth phrase and it's different than what came before because there's some change in something right there,
Yes. Yeah.
whatever it may
Yeah.
be.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
The context thing,
Mhm.
is that maybe also that you learn, like you need to learn your intervals and stuff like that, and then the carryover to transcribing a melody is like the gap is too high. Is that because intervals in itself lack the context, and it's not, you're not practicing your
Yeah.
a major sixth? Okay, you can recognize a major sixth, but when it comes up C A and then the melody continues, you might not pick it up at all, for
Right,
instance.
exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. Because, yeah, intervals in and of themselves don't give you any context. And a major sixth can sound really different depending on the context of how those notes are working, right? And that's why, like in the rest of the world, you guys use fixed do, that C is always do. In the United States, we use movable do. So whatever key you're in that note is do. Um, and I'm an American, so I'm biased because I learned movable do. But what movable do does is that it gives you like a context that like T to do always has the same relationship, that it's always the leading tone going to the tonic, and you can kind of feel the pull of that leading tone. And if you end on that leading tone, like you don't feel good, it has to go one more note,
Yeah.
right? And like it gives you an automatic context. And so, like, if you have T, I mean, a half step is pretty easy to recognize, but like if you have T going to do as a half step, that feels very different in terms of how it feels than a half step somewhere else. Or like do going to so, a perfect fifth. Larger intervals are often harder to hear, right? Like so going down to do, that feels really like settled and like, okay, that's nice. And like you can recognize that it's a perfect fifth, but you also recognize like how that feels in terms of the settledness. But like, okay, so to do, that's one thing. But like la to re, that's a really different thing. Like it's the same interval, but it feels really, really, really different. And I think most people wouldn't, I mean, I guess you hear that as a perfect fifth, but I think most people hear the context more. And
Hmm.
like ending on re, that also has a feeling you have to go to do, right? It has that pull down to the key you're in. And that is what you hear more in most cases, right? Because you're hearing the context. Again, brains like context, and it's going to hear that in the context. It's not going to hear it as like an isolated interval outside of anything else. And so if people are only listening like intervallically like that and they're ignoring the context, it makes it really hard to figure out what you're hearing and do a transcription. Similarly, if you are listening to the context, but you're trying to listen intervallically, you're like butting heads with yourself, that you're kind of listening to two different things. And so being aware, like, oh, wait, what is the context that these pitches exist in and how do they feel? Like, that's really important information.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting that the emphasis on how does it feel, like you have the
Yeah,
association with like you mentioned before as well, like it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like
right,
it means something. It feel a third, the me
right.
feels a kind of way within the tonal system or whatever. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And like if I say C, that note means nothing. But if I say we're in C major and now I'm going to play a C now, it means something to you,
yeah,
right? Or if I
yeah,
say B, means nothing to you. But if I say we're in C major and I play a B, now you have a really different feeling in your body than if I played a C. But if I played a B major chord, now that B feels totally different, even though
Yeah.
it's the same note, right?
Yeah.
And so, and I think we all like going back to like the discussion of babies and like what we hear in enculturation, like even people that have had zero musical education whatsoever can feel this, right? That you can feel, you have this intuitive sense just from growing up in our culture and hearing music. You have this intuitive sense that like, if you're in C major and you're sitting on a B, you got to go to C. And if you don't go to C, that's really unsatisfying,
Yeah.
right? But if you're in B major and you're sitting on a B, you feel great, right? And we have this intuitive sense from just growing up in this culture. And if we ignore that, then we're missing a very helpful set of tools in understanding like what we're hearing and how it works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's also, when I was back in school and getting ear training, almost not that I can think of anyone saying like, okay, how does this feel? Like,
Right,
get your other senses involved, and it's just focus on what's this distance? What's this interval?
right,
Very very dry, cut and dry, but not trying
right,
to couple it with a feeling or I think over time, like fifths, okay, they sound open, and fourth sounds, you start putting. I put my own labels on it, so fourth
yeah,
sounds a bit more boxy. I don't know.
yeah,
It's just a term that I associate with it, but
yeah, yeah.
I think maybe a lot of people they just don't involve that side with it.
Right. Yeah, that it becomes too intellectual.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm somebody that's very analytical and intellectual, and I tend to go into my head too much. But like when these musical things are truly embodied, that you feel like this note or this chord feels in this way, or like this chord has to resolve to here because like you just feel that it wants to go there versus like if you resolve it somewhere else, it has a different feeling if the sense of rhythm and pulse is embodied and it's not just like this cognitive exercise, like
Yeah.
it works way, way, way better. And that's where Dalcroze Eurythmics comes from. I don't know if you guys have that over there, but like,
I don't
um,
think so. Maybe. I don't know.
okay. So your Dalcroze was a guy. He was I don't know enough about his background to say where he's from, but I feel very ignorant right now. But Dalcroze was a guy, and he invented this thing, Dalcroze Eurythmics, which is essentially a practice of learning to embody these things. And I've only taken a few, like done some workshops with Eurythmics, but basically it's learning to sort of reconnect to this feeling of what do these musical ideas, rhythm, harmony, melody, like what do they feel like in the body? And
Hmm.
when you have that really embodied sense and understanding, it's really, really powerful and it aids musical understanding, music making, like everything. If it's just intellectual, it doesn't work as well. It's important as like a trained musician to understand intellectually what's going on, right? But if that's all you have, that you're cutting out very, very important sources of information.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of a course I loved it at the conservative. It was called Percussion and Pulse,
Uh-huh.
uh, and you had to step in time. You had to
Uh-huh.
stand,
Uh-huh.
move your feet in time, and then you had to count stuff and clap polyrhythms. And
Yep.
that
That's
was
your rhythmics. Yeah,
that's
that's your rhythmics.
whoever I can teach that stuff. If people ask us, I'm having trouble with hearing rhythms and
Yep.
can't figure things out. Practice that stuff.
Yep. Yep.
And it's true. Like, yeah, once it's in your body, in your mind, it's once, yeah, to put it
Right.
a little bit more woo-woo, once it becomes a part of you, recognizing that stuff and being able to, then you can easily pick it up in your brain and in your
Yep.
mind and then slow it down in your mind or whatever, and
Yep.
you can dissect stuff. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
very fascinating how that works.
Yeah, I mean that we have like knowledge that you can like say to somebody in words is called explicit knowledge, like your knowledge of like facts or like, things you've experienced or whatever. But we also have a lot of implicit knowledge, things that you just know, things that you just feel. And we, especially in like Western society, we tend to really prioritize explicit knowledge and we tend to discount implicit knowledge and understanding. But implicit knowledge and understanding is really powerful and really important. And yeah, we ignore it at our own peril, and it makes things a lot more difficult if you're only going at it intellectually, which I mean that is how I try to do life, is going at things intellectually. And I have to remind myself, like, no, there has to be an intuitive, implicit sense of this too. Otherwise, it's not going to work so well.
Hmm. Hmm. Usually when people hear like intuition or something, that's, it's maybe it has the association that it's something you have or it happens, but it's also something you develop, or
Right.
through training you get more sensitive to stuff, and then it
Yeah.
gets intuitive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because the brain, I mean, the brain is constantly taking in so much information, right? Going back to our discussion of babies, like babies are not sitting there with a parent being like, hear this sound, don't hear this sound. Like it's not intellectual training, right? Like babies are just taking in the information and their brain is noticing things and like doing things with it. And it's implicit knowledge, right? Like if anybody's ever asked you, why do you say it this way and not this way? Like, I don't know, you just say it that way. That's just
Yeah.
like, that's how you say it. You just know, that's implicit knowledge. But that's not something you were born with. That's something that your brain figured out by growing up in whatever language culture you were in. And it's not just language, it's like everything. Our brain is constantly taking in information and figuring out sort of what the deal is with what's out there in the world, and that develops our intuition. And so it's absolutely something that could be trained. We're not born, I mean, we're born with like survival instincts, but like beyond
Right.
that, like any other intuitions we have about things, it's because it's been trained by our brain sort of automatically without us like trying to, essentially.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't know if you have still a couple of more minutes, but
Yeah, I do, definitely.
maybe we can dive a bit more into improvisation itself.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know if there's something you want to share right off the bat, just improvisation in general, or
Yes. Yeah. So first, so I'm not an improviser, but one thing that I'll send you the link so you can share it with your channel. There's a researcher, and his name is Charles Lim, who he's trained as a jazz pianist, but he's a neuroscience researcher who's done really, really, really cool research on improvisation. He has a great TED Talk about his research. So make sure you have the link for that if you don't already know that TED Talk. But basically what they've found in the brains of improvisers, which I just think is like so cool, when they have somebody play like something they've learned and memorized versus when they've improvised something, is when people are improvising, the part of the brain that's involved in sort of self-monitoring and sort of self-censoring essentially turns off. And parts of the brain that are involved in self-expression are turned on way more. So when people are improvising, there's a lot less, yeah, self-censoring and just self-monitoring. And it's just like more pure self-expression, which is super cool. And you don't see that when people are playing something that they've memorized. So I'll make sure you have that link so you can share it with, yeah, because I think that's very cool for everybody to know, but especially improvisers to know that
yeah,
that's
yeah.
what's going on.
That's probably the biggest hurdle for people starting out improvisation. Like that part is not turning off. The
Right.
the self-awareness is
Exactly.
very high, and like
Yeah,
you're judging
exactly.
every minute thing you're doing, and
Right. Yeah, and what they found in, so that this, what I was just talking about was like the first study that they did, and they found this, in the brains of these improvisers. And then there's a study that was done a little later where they took people with varying levels of improvisation experience, and they found that the more experienced somebody was, the more these brain areas turn off, and the less experienced, the
yeah,
more the brain
yeah,
areas
yeah,
are on. Um, And I think that, and that research in my mind kind of connects to the research on flow, which
mm,
is like when you're in a flow state that it feels sort of very effortless in a way that you're able to do something that's very difficult without, like, you are very focused in a flow state, but it feels, yeah, effortless in a way, and you're just able to kind of do it.
mhm,
Um, and I think it can, especially when you're starting out at something and you're not very good yet, it can feel very scary to just like let go and just like let it happen, because you're so afraid of making mistakes. And it feels like, okay, this will be better if I control all of it and hold on to all of it. Um, and so I think the sort of willingness to let go of control and be like, it's okay if it's not good. It's okay if it's terrible improvisation. It's okay if you make mistakes, right? Because one, you learn from mistakes, and two, like you're learning this skill of sort of letting go, and that's what you actually need to improvise well. And so yeah, like nobody likes making mistakes. Nobody likes sounding bad. Nobody likes, trying to improvise and having it come out and be this like horrible, horrible thing. But like being willing to essentially fall on your face and it's
Mhm.
like, it's fine. You're not going to die. Like it's not the end of the world. Like, it's useful to do that. Um, and I think knowing this research can help give people the courage to try and to just, okay, maybe it's terrible, but that's okay.
Whatever.
Whatever, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. If I um like refer back to my own experiences and try to in retrospect think of how it feels like the flow state and stuff, it's I also do I also took up conducting, and
Hmm.
that was like way out of my comfort zone, and
Yeah.
I tend to go way inside my head. So
Uh-huh.
I'm trying to analyze things and coming up, people are watching and I have to say something and I blah, 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 and now
Yeah.
I'm over that, and now I'm doing rehearsals of 2 hours or whatever with relative ease.
Yeah.
Um,
Cool.
but the difference, if I look back, is being inside your head, being very much like in your body, and being very
Yeah.
aware of that, and being aware of just what's going on around you, and
Out
being
there.
focused on the music, and or
Yeah.
it's also something that takes time, and it's also a skill you develop, and you get more
Yep.
comfortable with the situation, and you
Mhm.
you just need to get used to having people in front of you, whether
Right.
you're improvising or you're leading a rehearsal or whatever. And then for me, the inner dialogue sort of faded away, and there was room to focus on the outer world instead of your inner
Inner
world.
world. Yeah, exactly. And you're right. What you just said, it's a skill, right? It's a skill that you have to learn and get used to. And like, I think it's normal and natural that when we learn something new, we're going to be very inwardly focused and we're going to be, yeah, just not able to take in information because there's only so much information you can process at any given time,
Yeah.
right? And if you're doing a skill that's new to you, that's really hard, like that's going to take all your processing capacity. You probably don't have any excess capacity to pay attention to anything else sort of around you, right? And as it gets easier to do whatever skill that you're doing, then you have more space in your brain to sort of pay attention to other things. And so like with new improvisers, like they're new to improvising, but they're probably new to like the whole language that they're improvising in. They may be new to like playing the instrument itself. There's just like a lot of things that are taking up brain space
Yeah.
that make it really hard to sort of get out of yourself. But as, the instrumental skills become more automatic, as the sort of building blocks of the musical language, scales or whatever that it's built on, as that becomes more automatic, then your brain doesn't have to spend so much energy kind of thinking about those, and it can broaden its attention.
Yeah. Yeah. I think people, like, especially with improvising, like we get in the deep way too fast, and
Right.
take little chunks, maybe a pre-made melody or just a couple of notes that you're going to play with, and do something with that. And no, it's like we're gonna take this song, these chord changes, and you have these scales, and these are the chord
Right.
tones, and it's like, oh my God, what
No,
the
too
hell am I gonna
much.
do?
Too much. Yeah, too much. Yeah. I mean, I said I don't really have experience as an improviser, but I attended this class that, oh gosh, when was it? It was like 7, 8 years ago, where the person leading the class was getting us to improvise on a single note, not in any given style, just you have one note. You can do so much with one note, right? And because it's only one note and you don't have to worry about changing notes or chords or like anything like that, right? It makes it so much more approachable. And because it's one note, you're not in any style whatsoever,
Yeah,
and so you don't feel so inhibited, like, oh, I don't know these chord changes, or I don't know these scales, or I don't know. And you don't even have, you just play one note. You don't have to like change anything, right? You can just change speed or volume or articulation or like whatever you want. And I thought that that was such a great way to approach improvisation, that it's just like, okay, here's one thing that you can play one note, you know how to play one note, and you can, it was hard to get people outside the box in terms of, okay, what can I do
Right.
with one note? But it wasn't that you were overwhelmed by, like you just said, like all this information that you have to keep in mind. It's like, oh no, I can't, my brain can't handle that.
Yeah, yeah. Also, especially with jazz, it's like, oh, am I playing jazz correctly? Like
Right.
I have to learn the specific vocabulary and stuff like that. Like slow down and get used to, and like you said, just the skill or whatever, just improvising in itself, being able to come up with something. It doesn't have to be in a specific style just yet, you know.
Right.
I
Right.
think we
Yeah, the skill of just sort of thinking creatively and thinking outside the box. And it was interesting in this workshop. It was a group. And so, we were given, okay, here you have a note and you improvise on this note. And then everybody was kind of improvising like at the same time. And it was just like a cacophony. And what was funny that happened is everybody was kind of just experimenting with like different speeds of repeating this note. It was all string players, different speeds of repeating this note and like different volumes. And then one person did like plucked their string, like pizzicato, or one person did some sort of extended technique. And then everybody started doing that. I was like, oh, it's a new
right.
idea.
Yeah.
And so being able to sort of think of new ideas like that. Oh, wait, I don't have to just play with the bow. I can pluck, or I don't have to use my bow in like a normal way. I can use my bow in a really weird way that I would
Yeah.
never use, and that skill of being able to sort of think outside the narrow focus of this is how I normally play.
Hmm.
Like you said, that's a skill in and of itself that you need for improvisation that has nothing to do with style or language or anything
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that. But is
That's
just as important, right, as knowing how to do jazz correctly or whatever.
yeah. Yeah. That's what's the term? Is that divergent thinking?
Yeah, divergent thinking. Yeah.
Right. You have one pen or one note to come up with 100 different ways of
Right.
doing something with it. Yeah.
Right. And that's absolutely a skill. And it's easier for some people than other people, but people tend to think like, okay, I'm creative or I'm not. No, you're not.
Right.
Every human is creative. Some people just exercise that skill more than others. And if you feel uncreative, that's fine. Like you can learn it. It's a skill.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Very interesting stuff.
Yes. Brains are
Um,
fascinating.
oh yeah. Maybe some final closing questions.
Sure.
What are the most common things you see that hold people back in their musical development?
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's a really good question. Um, I think the biggest thing that holds people back are self-limiting beliefs.
Mm,
Terms of what we were talking about earlier, like I should be able to do XYZ. Um, or yeah, self-limiting beliefs and using that to beat themselves up. Like, what's wrong with me that I can't do this? What's wrong? That I think really stops people rather than realizing like anything's a skill. You can get better at anything. It doesn't matter
yeah.
how long it takes. It doesn't matter that it's harder for you than someone else. It doesn't matter. It's a skill. You can learn it. So not realizing that I think really, really, really holds people back. I would say that's the biggest thing that gets in people's way.
Right.
Um, and
And
then the other big thing is not taking enough breaks. That people are just like pounding away on something and burning their brains out and wondering why their brain isn't working the way they want it to. It's like, well, you need to take more breaks.
usually it's we have to say like you need to practice more, but
Take
sometimes
breaks.
we need to say you need to take a break more.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And learning to take breaks is also a skill. Everything is a skill, right? Everything boils down to it's a skill.
Yeah. So if if there's a student yet that you come across and they seem to keep hitting like or they
Mhm.
hit a ceiling or whatever, is it like just is something wrong in their practicing strategy, or could there really be like a limit to motor skills?
Yeah, I mean, I have never had a student that when they hit a ceiling, it's due to some like biological limit that they have that it's always been some kind of practicing issue with how they're practicing. And I do ask students to record themselves practicing and send it to me so I
Yeah.
can watch. Because there have been times that I was like, I wonder if this is something that this student just like can't do because all of our brains are different, right?
Yeah.
Like I am never going to be able to like hear something in my mind. That is a limit that I have, right? But whenever I've sort of wondered, I wonder if there's something else going on here that like more training can't overcome. When I ask them to video themselves and send me their practicing, instantly it's like, okay, well, that's why they can't do this because they're practicing in this way that's like not going to work or is not actually working on that skill. So like yes, we have biological limits. Like I will never be able to dunk a basketball like Michael Jordan because I'm not tall enough, right? And that's nothing I can do about that. I'm never going to be able to fly because I'm a human and I'm not a bird, right? Like there are biological limits, yes, but the brain is very, very adaptable and very, very plastic. And so for all intents and purposes, the biological limits that someone may have are irrelevant. Like you can
Mhm.
always find a way around it. Maybe it's not the solution that somebody else would have to get around that roadblock, but that doesn't matter. Like you're your own person and you can
Yeah.
find your own, way to get around that.
Yeah. Yeah. The most common thing, again, from the more mature students I hear is, I'm too old. It,
Yeah. Right. And sure, it's true. It's harder to learn things when you're older because your body starts to break down, your brain starts to
mm,
work. But like, there's no such thing as too old to learn something. And if you were too old to learn something new, you would not be able to learn the name of somebody you just met for the first time because that's something new that you just learned. You just
yeah.
met that person, you learned their name, and you're learning to recognize them when you see them at work or whatever. If you can do that, that means your brain can still learn new things. Maybe it's harder to learn guitar than to learn, this new guy at work, what he looks like and what his name is. But it's essentially, it's the same thing. Like it's a new skill, right?
Yeah.
And so like it's going to be harder, but you're not too old. You're never too old. Maybe it's going to take you longer. Maybe it's going to be harder than if you tried to learn it when you were 7 years old, but you can still do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that confirmation.
Yes.
um, any
And
advice
in
for?
fact, actually, I should say for older students, so the learning an instrument and being a musician is very sort of protective for the brain. We see that older people that have been musicians, their brain is sort of protected against the effects of aging in a way that other people's brains aren't. And there is a study that was done on older adults, ages, I want to say like 59 to 74, something like that. So older adults who had never ever played an instrument, and they gave them piano lessons for, I think it was 6 months. I don't remember how long, but like a decently long amount of time for a scientific study. Actually, they split these people into two groups. One group had like a music appreciation type class where they did like a lot of listening, and this other group like learned to play piano, and they were having like weekly lessons, like the whole shebang. And they scan their brains before and after. And something that happens as we get older is what's called cortical thinning, that our brains just our brains just sort of start to thin. And there was the cortical thinning that you would expect to find due to age didn't happen in the group that played piano, even though they had not played their whole lives and they started, when they were older. You still see these protective effects of learning an instrument, even if you don't start until much, much later
Right.
in life, which is really cool
Yeah.
that happens. So even if you can't play as well as maybe if you had started when you were 7, like it will benefit you in terms of cognitive aging.
Yeah. 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 That's awesome. That's just
Yeah,
awesome.
it is awesome. It is awesome. And the group that just listened didn't have that. They had normal levels of cortical thinning. So it was
Yeah.
only the group that played piano that was like protected against that
Yeah. Yeah.
essentially.
You have to actively.
You have to actually do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well. Okay. Do you have any advice for people who don't have 4 hours a day to practice?
Yes. I no longer have 4 hours a day to practice. So this is advice for me too. Um, One is that you can get a lot done in a lot shorter amount of time than you think. Like our conversation we started
Yeah.
with just 3 minutes. That like if you have limited time to practice in a way, that's great because it forces you to be very specific. And the research on like what separates top performers from everyone else in terms of how they practice, one thing that they find is that top performers are way, way more specific in terms of setting goals for themselves, in terms of sort of self-monitoring while they're practicing, like what's going well, what's not going well. They're just way, way, way more specific. And when you have less time to practice, it kind of forces you to be more specific in that way, which is great. If you're not being more specific, like be more specific, so you get more out of your time. If you have less time to practice, it's also really important to take breaks, even though it seems like, well, I have less time, I don't want to take breaks. You'll get more out of it if you take
Mm,
breaks. And it's also important to interleave your practice, so to constantly be switching between things and, don't just do one thing for one big block of time and then don't come back to it again until like tomorrow. Like do a little bit of practice on, this thing, whatever it is, go work on some other stuff, come back to that first thing, work on some other stuff, come back. Because when you come back to things repeatedly and you give your brain that reminder, and your brain's like, oh, right, yeah, I remember we worked on that like half an hour ago. Okay. Then you remember it better because your brain is getting those reminders rather than just like doing it for one big block of time.
right, right. And it's also something you can do throughout the day, probably. Like you do something in the
Exactly.
morning and then afternoon, evening.
Yep. Yep, exactly. And it's way better to practice that way than like, let's say you have 2 hours to practice, or let's say you have an hour to practice in your whole day. It's way better to do 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon, 20 minutes in the evening than an hour sort of all at once because you get breaks and you also get to come back to things and give your brain that reminder. Sometimes that's not possible. Like people have like 1 hour that they are able to practice when they get home from work before they have to eat dinner or, whatever.
Yeah.
And, that's fine. Within that hour, make sure you're switching between things and coming back. But if you do have the ability to do shorter segments distributed throughout the day, that's going to be way better. Same thing for people who are practicing 4 hours. Don't do 4 hours all at once. Distribute it throughout the day for you too.
Yeah. That's also a very interesting way of thinking about like I practice 4 hours today. Doesn't have to be in one block. Doesn't mean you have
No,
to.
no, and it's way better if it's not in one block. You'll get
Yeah.
way more out of it if it's not in one block.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
If you only have with keeping overall musicianship in mind, if you only
Uh-huh.
had 30 minutes to study
Uh-huh.
something or practice something, what would that be?
Yeah. So 30 minutes total in the day that
Yeah.
you're practicing, you say.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that it's important to always ask, what are my priorities, today? If you have 30 minutes every single day and you never have more than 30 minutes, figuring out, okay, you want to probably do, especially for a jazz musician, you probably want to do a little bit of ear training every day. Maybe it's only 5 minutes, right? But you want to do a little bit of ear training. You want to do some technical work. People tend to deprioritize that you're not working on your fundamentals, but that's
Mhm.
really, really, really important. The fundamentals help us make them more automatic, like we were talking about. So you have more brain space for other things that you want to spend some time on your fundamentals, and then with the rest of the time you have, like, what is your priority in terms of like songs you're learning or skills you're learning or whatever it is you're working on. What is your priority?
Mhm.
If it's you normally practice for 2 hours or 4 hours or whatever, but today you only have 30 minutes, again, what is your priority? What's the most important thing that you want to touch on today, and everything else can, kind of be left aside. But I think, I mean, I keep a practice journal where I write down. I don't write down how much time I spent practicing or what I practice. I write down what I need to do. I write down
Okay.
at the end of my practice session because it's the most obvious, right? When I'm done practicing, like, okay, these are the things that need attention, and I write those down. And so if I'm crunched on time, I can look at that and be like, okay, I have these 5 things on my list that I want to do, but like this one, that's the one that's like a real problem. So that's what I'm going to do today. The other ones, like they can wait till tomorrow when I have more time or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah. That's interesting. That's a very good idea to at the end of the practice session, then write down what you need to do.
Right, because it's fresh in your mind, right? And you
Yeah.
don't really have to think about it, and it takes 2 seconds versus if you if you wait till the next day. I mean, yeah, like if you come back the next day, you're like, what was I working on? You waste
Right.
time trying to
Yeah.
remember what you're supposed to do. But if you have it there, a list from yourself from yesterday, right when you just finished, like you know exactly, oh, yep, okay, that's what I have to do. Oh, yeah, that one's really bad. Okay, I'm going to start with.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very cool. Um, is there something you're currently working on, like new research or
Yeah, so
music wise, or?
Yeah, the school year just ended, so I'm in like transition phase. So I am music wise actually. Um, I'm putting together a new program with so I released an album last year, last February. And the pianist that I played that with, we're putting together a new program that will be performing a bunch next year. But we're in the process of deciding rep, so I don't actually know what the music is that I'm going to learn yet because we're sort of discussing rep. So I will be starting to learn a whole bunch of new music like within the next week, actually. So that's exciting, but I don't know what it is yet, which is also kind of exciting.
Yeah.
And then in terms of like research stuff, I have a whole boatload of like I have this huge list on my phone of things that I want to look into and things that other people want me to look into. So yeah, I read an article. I've gotten a lot of questions recently about older learners, and how is the brain different. And I was just reading a paper along those lines the other day. So that's one of the things. Another big area is there wasn't a lot of research for a long time on like rhythm and sense of pulse and that. There's some, but there wasn't a lot. But there's a lot more now that I haven't had a chance to really dig into. So that's another sort of big area that I'm sort of looking into. So
Right, right, right. Okay,
yeah.
very interesting. And if you have new material coming out, research-wise or music-wise, where can people most easily find that?
Yes. So the two places that, well, actually three places. One is my YouTube channel. I make like long form videos on there talking about like the research and how you apply this. I also post shorter videos on Instagram, because it's Instagram. Nobody wants to watch a long form video there. So yeah, those are the two places I post like videos on that kind of stuff. And then I started in February, I started a new newsletter. I kind of hate newsletters. I don't have time to read them. So it's very short. It comes out 3 times a month, the 1st, the 11th, and the 21st. And it's one question, one idea about practicing, one question to ask yourself, and one practice tip. It's really, really short. I think it probably takes people 30 seconds to read. But people say it's really helpful and just gives them something to think about. So 3 times a month, three things. And so that's, yeah, you can sign up for that on my website. But in terms of like me talking about new research and stuff like that, YouTube or Instagram are the places.
Right, right, right.
And
And
I'm the only Molly Gebrian in the whole world, so I'm really easy to find. People just Google my name and it will come up.
awesome. And also the music stuff you post on your channel as well? Or is
Yeah,
that
yeah, any performing stuff is also on my YouTube channel. But I perform I perform a lot less than I used to because I'm doing this this kind of thing full time. But yeah, any performing stuff is also I'll post on my YouTube channel.
right? All right, cool. Of course, we're gonna link everywhere and anywhere to all that stuff.
Awesome.
Um, I'm actually through all my questions. I don't think I missed one.
Cool. That's amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed it. It's just fascinating stuff, and you obviously have like a library stuffed inside your head. So
I do
it's
have a library stuff inside my head, but yeah, it was great. It was really fun for me too. You asked great questions, and yeah, we got to talk about all sorts of interesting things.